Hey, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. It's Friday, it's a solo episode day, and I'm super excited about it because we are talking all about carbs. So I did get a question recently about, the question was, what are the best types of carbs to include in a carb up? And I figured it would be best to kind of dive into a few different strategies and really, think about this in a strategic way, because we always talk about, especially on this podcast, that, carbs aren't the devil, right? We should, think about incorporating carbs strategically based off of where we're at in our journey, what our goals are, and all of that. So I did want to dive into that today and kind of go through a few different things to think about as you're thinking about the types of carbs to include based off of what the specific goal is. So we're going to jump into that today. We're also going to jump into honey. So I got a question about honey, and so I want to dive into the benefits of honey and kind of unpack that a little bit, because it is super interesting. I actually did a little bit of research myself and learned a lot. So I want to chat about that a little bit. But before we jump into this, I do want to announce our sponsor for this month. So I'm super excited. We have a new sponsor, Organifi. So Organifi is a line of organic superfood blends that offers plant-based nutrition made with high quality ingredients. Each Organifi blend is science-backed with effective doses and ingredients that are organic, free of fillers, and they also contain less than 3 grams of sugar per serving. So if you follow me on Instagram or social media, you've probably seen me post a lot about my protein ice cream, which I have very often. And I usually use a few different types of protein powders, depending on, what I'm feeling like. And one of my go-tos is the Organifi chocolate protein powder. I really like the taste of it. It has, like I said, super high quality ingredients. It is a plant-based protein powder, so I alternate between that and whey. But if I'm going for a plant-based protein powder, Organifi is definitely my go-to. Also, there's something that I've been starting to incorporate a little bit more, which I'm actually going to talk about in this episode, is the Organifi Red Juice. So I've started to add that into my pre-workout drink. And I'm not going to talk all about that right now, because I'm actually going to dive into it in a little bit when we talk about carbs and pre-workout carbs. So stay tuned for that. But if you do want to check out any of the Organifi products, you can go to www.organifi.com/METFLEX, and you can use the code METFLEX for 15% off any of their products. I will link to the website and that code in the show notes. And yeah, so as always, if you're enjoying this podcast, please make sure to leave a review on iTunes, or you can share it out on social media to help spread the word about the show. You can also take a screenshot of the episode while you're listening to it, post it on your Instagram story, and tag me. My handle's @rachelgregory.cns. And that would also really help to help the show, reach more people and get it out there more. So without further ado, let's jump into the episode and chat all about carbs. Okay, so the specific question that I got was, what is the best way to carb up? Using starchy carbs, fibrous carbs, sugars, sugar plus fat, or starch plus fat? Okay, so this is a really great question. And, one of the reasons why I wanted to dive into this pretty extensively is because there's a lot of different ways that I can answer this question. So I figured, to hit on all these different types of carbs, it makes the most sense to kind of divide up what the goal of the carb up is. So before I do jump into that, I do want to mention that I did record an episode that was all about carb ups, carb cycling, and I really, took a deep dive into all of that and, when to think about incorporating carb ups based off of, different signs and symptoms that you could use a carb up, how many carbs and how often to carb up, monthly carb up options for women, weekly carb up options. And then I also dove into daily or pre and post workout carb up options, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So that episode was episode 18 it was called Carb Ups, Carb Cycling, and Building an Anti-Fragile Metabolism. So I will link that in the show notes. In that episode, I guess you could say that that's probably part 1 and this is probably part 2 of kind of the carb focus. But that one really dives into like a lot of specifics. So definitely check out that episode after you listen to this one. Again, I'll link that in the show notes. But when we're talking about incorporating carbs, I do like to first kind of lay out a few simple quote unquote rules to think about when you are incorporating carbs. So the first, and when I say rules, these are just things that, I think about all the time, and I recommend to my clients to really think about this when you're incorporating or when you're using carbs strategically, right? Which we're going to talk about in a second. So a few of the simple rules. The first one would be whole foods first. So I talk about this all the time, but thinking about whenever you're consuming food, 2 things to think about. Did it have a face at some point, or has it grown from the earth at some point? If it checks either of those boxes, it's most likely a whole food. And when we're talking about carbs, usually that would be, the ones that have grown from the earth at some point. So think vegetables, fruits, tubers, potatoes, things like that. So that would be, quote unquote, rule number 1. I don't know if I like to refer to this as rules, but I'm just going to go with it. So the second one is no naked carbs. So this just means that when you do consume a carbohydrate source, whether it's, fruits or potatoes or whatever it is, especially if they are lower in fiber, then I always recommend having some other type of macro with it. So, consuming some fat with it or some protein with it. So you're not just consuming like a straight naked carb is what we call it. And that will prevent a huge spike in blood sugar and then a subsequent crash in blood sugar, which we obviously don't want. So even just having a little bit of fat or a little bit of protein with that carb can help to kind of mitigate that spike. We will talk about in a second why you might want that spike, but you will still get like a spike in blood sugar. Like for example, if you're consuming white rice, having a little bit of fat or some protein with that, you'll still get a spike, but it might not be, as huge. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So no naked carbs would be number 2. And then the third one I would think about is just starting with the minimal effective dose. So that just means, if you haven't been incorporating carbs in your, diet for a while, so you've been following like a low carb or a keto protocol for a long time, and you're just thinking about starting to incorporate carbs, I would start off with the minimal effective dose, just meaning like gradually incorporating carbs, probably first start, around your workouts. And then also obviously depending on what the goal of the carb up is, which we'll talk about in a second. But just starting with the minimal effective dose is probably the best place to start, because then you're kind of utilizing, as many carbs as you need to fuel whatever the goal is, right? So those would be the 3, just always whole foods first, no naked carbs, and then starting with the minimal effective dose. So kind of going into the overall topic here in terms of the goal of the carb up. So there's kind of 3 categories that I like to categorize these goals as. So the first one would be, using carbs for energy for performance, right? So this would be more so like pre-workout carbs. The second one would be recovery or post-workout carbs. So using carbs to refill muscle glycogen stores and aid in overall recovery and getting you kind of back into that parasympathetic rest and digest state. And then the third category would be cycle regulation or hormonal regulation. So this could be where you're incorporating monthly carb ups or, biweekly carb ups or whatever that may be. So these are kind of those are 3 categories that I want to dive into and then kind of talk about the carbs that I would recommend focusing on depending on what the goal is, right? So depending on what your goal is with either, energy for performance, recovery, or if it's, cycle or hormonal regulation, we'll dive into that. So to start, I'm going to kind of work my way backwards actually. So with cycle and hormonal regulations, when we're talking about carb ups and carb cycling, I did do a full episode on this with Allie Miller. So instead of, diving into all the specifics with this, I do want to refer you to that episode because we talked extensively about carb ups, carb cycling, especially for hormonal purposes. We talked about the importance of leptin regulation, the HPA axis, stress, a lot of different things pertaining to this. So I'm going to link that episode in the show notes. It's episode 9 and it's called Stress and Fat Loss, Hormone Balance, and Carb Cycling with Allie Miller. So again, chatting all about incorporating carbs specifically for regulating your cycle and for hormonal regulation. So definitely check out that episode 9 with Allie Miller. Again, I'll link it in the show notes. And then kind of going into the next category, again, kind of reversing from how I started. So number 2 is recovery and post-workout. So thinking about, okay, what types of carbs should I be incorporating to aid in my recovery, especially after my workouts? So typically the goal of a post-workout meal is to, 1, calm the nervous system, right? And this just means reducing the stress response from training. So again, like I said, getting out of that sympathetic state and more into a parasympathetic state. And just to kind of clarify that, a sympathetic state is also known as like the flight or fight mode. And a parasympathetic state is more so like that rest and digest mode. So you can think about that. So that's probably like the main goal of the post-workout meal, the number 1, I would say. And then also, just kickstarting the recovery process, which is included in that as well, refilling muscle glycogen stores, and then also stimulating protein synthesis, which just means, making new protein to help build more muscle, and then also avoiding the catabolic state that comes with post-workout. So especially if you've drained all your energy, you're more likely to be in that catabolic or breakdown state. And if you're looking to build muscle or just repair, recover, and build, you don't want to be in that catabolic state for a long time. So post-workout is a great time to incorporate, obviously, protein, carbs, to help get you out of that catabolic state and more into an anabolic build and recovery state. So we also know that your body is more insulin sensitive post-workout, and it is primed to use carbs to replenish muscle glycogen rather than store it as body fat. So faster digesting carbs do spike insulin. We know that, right? And when this happens, when you spike insulin, you actually blunt cortisol, which does help to shift you into more of that parasympathetic state and can aid with recovery. So kind of just to break this down a little bit. So carbs stimulate the release of insulin, like I mentioned, and insulin has an inverse relationship with cortisol. And we know cortisol is known as the stress hormone. So basically, as insulin increases, cortisol decreases. So cortisol, like I said, is our primary stress hormone, and it's also a catabolic hormone. So its primary role is to break things down for energy. And like I mentioned, we don't want to be in a catabolic state for a long period of time, especially after our workout, especially if the goal is to build muscle and recover, right? So helping to blunt that cortisol response can be super important and beneficial to help get you into that recovery state. And I've talked about this before, but cortisol it's not like there's no bad hormones, right? We need all of our hormones. They're there for a reason. Cortisol isn't bad. We need it to survive. We need it to, function. The issue is that a lot of us are spending too much time with elevated cortisol levels in this day and age, just because of just the crazy amount of stress that we are all under. So that's where it becomes an issue when you're spending too much time with chronically elevated cortisol levels, and not, getting out of that state, because that's when things can go wrong. So if the goal is to spike insulin post-workout to help blunt that cortisol response, and then also to refill muscle glycogen stores, which is important for, your next training session, then ideally starchier, easy to digest carbs would probably be the best option here. So post-workout, think starchier, easy to digest carbs. These would be things like, white rice, potatoes, whether that's white potatoes or sweet potatoes or whatever type of potato. Plantains are I believe they're technically a fruit, but they are obviously starchier than, bananas. So plantains could be an option, different types of squash. So those would be, starchier, easy to digest carbs. And again, those will help to actually spike insulin post-workout. And you're doing that for a reason, to help blunt that cortisol response. And then also to help kind of shuttle those nutrients into your muscles, because we know your muscles are, after a workout, your muscles are the most insulin sensitive at that time. So again, post-workout, focusing more on those starchier carbs, but then also including, protein, of course. So usually, 25 grams or more of protein is definitely a good option post-workout to help, kickstart that recovery process as well, and kind of turn that light switch on for muscle protein synthesis. And then also a little bit of fat along with that. I would probably, when we're talking about, nutrition around your workouts, especially close to the workouts, you'll probably won't want to consume a ton of fat. This also depends on obviously where you're coming from and like what, if you are following a very strict keto diet and your body is, very primed for using fat for fuel, then this is probably a little bit different. But if you are thinking of incorporating more carbs and trying that out, then I would probably stick with a little bit lower fat around your workout, so pre and post, just because that can slow down the digestive process a little bit, especially pre-workout, which that's what I'm going to talk about next. So the last kind of category, which is the first thing I mentioned, was using carbs for energy or performance, right? So this would be more so like pre-workout carbs. So whenever we're talking about pre-workout, like a meal, a snack, a supplement, whatever it is that you're consuming, the biggest thing is, and the biggest goal of that pre-workout meal should be, to optimize focus and energy for your workout. And then also think about consuming foods that absorb quickly and support quick stomach emptying. And this is obviously more important as you get closer to your workout, because you don't want to be, digesting tons of food going into your workout. Usually that's not a good idea for most people. So yeah, that would be like the main goal of your pre-workout meal, snack, or supplement. And in general, a good kind of, breakdown of what a good pre-workout meal or snack would include. Thinking, breaking down the macros. So starting with protein, about 20 to 50 grams of protein is a good range to be in. And again, you can, depending on how far out you're consuming this meal or snack, will depend on, how much protein. So for example, if you consumed a meal like 3 hours before and you had a really big bolus of protein, then you probably don't need as much protein closer to the workout. But if you didn't consume any protein for, many hours, then you probably need a little bit more. And the reason, 20 to 50, I would say 25 to 50 grams, and this depends on obviously your body weight as well. This is the kind of minimum to maximum muscle protein synthesis range. And it is size dependent, like I said, depending on how big you are. But again, muscle protein synthesis is just the, building of muscle, right? So that's just stimulating the growth of muscle and preventing, and then muscle protein breakdown would be the opposite, right? So the goal of consuming protein is to build, recover, and stimulate this process to be able to support our muscles and our kind of a lot of other things within our body as well, not just our muscles. So anyway, now I'm getting off topic, but that would be protein. And then carbs, like I said, starting with a minimal effective dose. So if we're talking about pre-workout, incorporating, maybe even starting with like only 10 grams of carbs, and then, working your way up like maybe 15, 20, and then even up to 50 grams or more, depending on, again, your size and, where you're coming from. So that would be, and I'm going to talk about carbs in a second, but probably around that, again, starting with a minimal effective dose first, especially if you are just starting to incorporate carb ups, is going to be important to kind of gauge how you react to that. And then in terms of fat, again, just pre-workout especially, and this also depends on, how close you are to your workout. So if you are, 2 or 3 hours out from your workout, you could probably consume more fat. If you're closer to your workout, you probably want to keep fat to, minimal, maybe around like 5 to 10 grams. just to, prevent the slowing down of the digestive process. Because again, you don't want to be digesting a ton of food going into your session, right? So when we're talking carbs specifically pre-workout, you'll ideally want a combination of both starch and fruit, obviously along with some protein and maybe a little bit of fat as well. But carbs specifically, the reason why you want this combo of starch and fruit is because you can actually utilize what we call multiple glucose transporters and therefore get a better absorption rate and also allow for more absorption of more nutrients, and then also still having a fast and a slow releasing carb to help sustain you through your entire workout so you don't have those spikes and big spikes and dips in blood sugar. And so we know, kind of getting back to this idea of the multiple glucose transporters and what that actually means. So we know, starch and fruit are basically carried throughout our body through different transporters. Fruit is fructose, right? And starchier carbs break down into glucose. So they utilize different transporters in our body to be absorbed. And so if you have a combo of these, you can actually increase that absorption rate. So there's a really great analogy that Chris Barakat explained in detail in an episode that we released a few weeks ago. I will link that episode in the show notes because he actually chats in detail about all of this. It's actually episode 71. It's called Lose Fat and Build Muscle. But basically the analogy was, if you have, a big group of people in an auditorium and the fire alarm goes off, right? Think about, if you have one door that people can exit through, it's going to take a lot longer to exit and get out of that auditorium versus if you had two doors, right? So 2 doors is going to be better than 1, especially if you are in fear that you're going to be in a fire. But it's a really good analogy to kind of think about how these different carb sources can be utilized a little bit more efficiently, right? So, fructose goes out one door, and starchier carbs, glucose, go out the other door. So you're you're more efficiently getting out the door. So if you think about that, in the sense of carbs being absorbed in your body, that actually makes sense. So again, I probably butchered that analogy a little bit. Chris explained it a lot better. I also used a different analogy in a previous episode about taking a bus to a certain place and having 2 buses instead of 1. But I like the fire alarm analogy a little bit better. So definitely check out that episode with Chris. But basically, you're just thinking about having a few different carb sources and fuel sources because you'll get a better absorption rate, they'll be transported a little bit faster, and also different nutrients as well coming from those different types of carbs. So when we're talking starches, typical pre-workout starches, you can think about oats, white rice, potatoes, rice cakes, things like that. Those would be more of the starchier carbs. And also you want to think about pre-workout not having, well, it depends on the person, but if you have too much fiber in your pre-workout meal and in, your pre-workout carb source. So for example, oats do have, fiber in them. So if you are someone that can get, or if you're sensitive to too much fiber, so maybe like you get some cramping or GI distress, then you might want to just be careful of that and kind of just be aware that maybe focusing on some of the starchier carbs that don't have as much fiber might be more advantageous for you. And then in terms of fruit, I recommend usually starting with berries and then also things like, oranges, nectarines, bananas, apples, really any type of fruit. And then, kind of going back to the fiber thing, some fruits do have more fiber than others. So you just want to be aware of that. For example, an apple with the skin is probably going to have a little bit more fiber than like a banana. But you can also get past the fiber part of an apple by maybe making like applesauce or having that instead. So obviously, usually applesauce is without the skin, so you're not going to get much fiber there. So yeah, just being aware of that and being aware of how you personally react to fiber and to also these different carb sources. So that would be my recommendation for, how to incorporate carbs in your pre-workout meal or snack or whatever it is. And then if we're talking more like unique carb sources and more on the lines of like supplementation, I've talked about UCAN Super Starch a lot in the past. They actually sponsored last month's episodes. So just a little recap, UCAN's patented ingredient, Super Starch, is a unique, slow-releasing, complex carbohydrate that doesn't spike blood sugar, and it delivers basically a slow and steady release of glucose into the bloodstream. So because it doesn't spike blood sugar, it actually doesn't cause a significant rise in blood insulin levels either, which permits greater use of fat for fuel relative to other carb sources. So it is a great, option and a great fuel source if you are fat adapted or you're following a lower carb or keto approach and you're maybe looking for just an extra boost during your workouts. Not to say that, it's better than whole food carbs. It's just another option. And not to say that, all of the other whole food carbs, especially if they have a little bit of fiber in them, especially if you're consuming them with protein and fat, you will kind of mitigate that big spike as well in blood sugar. So really just kind of thinking about that. But I like to use UCAN pretty often as my part of my pre-workout drink. And I just noticed that I have steady energy, good energy during my workouts, and actually helps me a little bit more towards the end of my workout, have a little bit more oomph, I guess, in my lifts as I get, towards the end and a little bit more fatigued. So UCAN Super Starch is an option. I will link, there's this discount code, I believe it's 20% off if you use the code METFLEXLIFE for any of UCAN's products. I'll link that in the show notes, and I'll link the website as well, so you can go to that. Then another unique carbohydrate source that I've actually been incorporating a little bit more pre-workout are beets or beet juice. I've been incorporating it in a supplement, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but beets are unique because they're actually packed with a compound called nitrate. Nitrate is a chemical naturally occurring in certain foods, and it's converted into nitric oxide when consumed. And research has actually shown that nitric oxide can increase blood flow, improve lung function, and actually strengthen muscle contraction. So I did a little bit of research, and I've, heard of this many, many times before, actually, in terms of incorporating beets and beetroot juice or beet supplementation pre-workout. I just haven't paid too much attention to it until now, until I got this question, and I did obviously a little bit more research on it. So I came across a systematic review, which is basically just a review of all of the studies that have looked at incorporating beetroot juice into a pre-workout, supplement, or just consuming beetroot juice on its own. And this, I will link this in the show notes. It was called Effects of Beetroot Juice Supplementation on Cardiorespiratory Endurance in Athletes, a Systematic Review. So a few of the studies within this review found that subjects who consumed beetroot juice before exercising were able to improve their maximum cardio output, which is just, we call that VO2 max. So they were able to improve their VO2 max and endurance significantly more than those who took a placebo. And the researchers found that the beet drinkers' muscles used ATP, which is just energy, more efficiently. So the beet juice drinkers needed less oxygen to perform, which is why they were able to go longer and harder. So this was in endurance athletes, but also we know that nitric oxide can actually help with creating a greater muscle pump. So it's not just for endurance athletes. We actually have studies that have shown that nitric oxide induced increase in blood flow can actually contribute to a greater muscle pump for, your lifting sessions, or going into your lifting sessions, or during your lifting sessions. Wow. So that is super interesting in terms of like beetroot juice. There are a bunch of supplements that I know are on the market, and this is where, I wanted to talk about Organifi Red Juice, because this is beetroot juice is one of the main ingredients. So I'm actually going to pull up the red juice really quickly on my computer so I can kind of talk you through the ingredients that are included in that. And this is something that I've started to incorporate in my pre-workout drink, like I mentioned. So some of the ingredients in Organifi Red Juice. So obviously beets is one of the main ones. There's other things like some adaptogenic herbs, things like cordyceps, rhodiola, reishi mushroom, ginseng, and then there's other kind of berry blends, so pomegranate, raspberry, cranberry, blueberry, strawberry. So those are all included in the Organifi Red Juice. So it's a really good option for like a pre-workout drink, especially if you maybe are sensitive to caffeine. You don't want to consume something that has caffeine in it, but you do want something that has a little bit, gives you a little bit more of that boost, right? So it also is, let me just look at the macros real quick here. So one scoop only has about 6 grams of carbs and 2 grams of sugar, 4 grams of fiber, which is not that much, and a total of 30 calories per scoop. So that could be a good option, you know, if you are looking for something else to consume pre-workout, especially, you know, before a lifting session maybe. So I will, again, link the Organifi code in the show notes, or you can go to www.organifi.com/MetFlex, and you can get 15% off if you want to try that out. So another unique carb source that you could potentially incorporate pre-workout is honey. So like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, I got a question specific to honey actually surrounding workouts. So I'm going to jump into that in a second. But honey is a unique carb source because it does contain a combo of glucose and fructose. So it's one of those multiple transportable carbs that we just talked about. So it is a really good option pre-workout. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit deeper in this next question. So the next question was, well, actually just to wrap up the last question in terms of different carb sources. So hopefully that helped to kind of, you know, give you a little bit more of a strategic way to look at the different types of carbs that you're consuming and how to place those around, whether it's pre-workout, post-workout, or if you're looking to incorporate carb ups for maybe cycle regulation. So there's different ways to kind of look at it, but that's how I would break that down. And hopefully all of that made sense. So getting into the question on honey. So someone asked, thoughts on honey being a carb source when trying to put on muscle. So before I jump into specifics on this, I do want to just break down like what is honey made up of exactly, right? So I mentioned it's a combination of both fructose, which is just fruit sugar, and glucose, which is just a simple sugar. So typically there's about 30 to 35%, or typically honey is made up of about 30 to 35% glucose and about 35 to 40% fructose. And then about 5 to 10% can consist of up to 25 different di and trisaccharides in varying quantities. So those are just different types of sugars. So we know that glucose alone has, you know, a high glycemic index, right? Which means it's directly absorbed in the bloodstream, which causes a surge and then a subsequent crash in energy potentially because it's, you know, causing that surge of blood sugar, which can lead to, especially if the spike is high, can lead to a big dip, right? Which can make you, you know, can basically set you up to kind of crash mid-workout if you're not careful. And that's why, you know, we just talked about incorporating different types of carb sources strategically, and why you would go about doing that. So this is why it's probably not ideal to just have, you know, straight glucose or sugar pre-workout unless it's for maybe like a very short burst of energy that you need to perform for a shorter period of time. So for example, if you're, you know, competing in a powerlifting meet and you need to just you do one lift for like 5 seconds, then maybe you consume like a little bit of sugar before that, or straight sugar before that, or maybe if it's like a sprint or a shorter CrossFit Metcon. So there are, you know, times where you can include just sugar or just glucose. But if you're looking to kind of sustain energy throughout a whole workout, it's probably not a good idea to have just a huge bolus of glucose because, again, that's going to lead to a huge spike and then potentially a big dip in your blood sugar, which will lead to a big spike and dip in energy. So like I said, honey is made up of a combo of glucose and fructose, so it generally has a lower glycemic response, which means it won't have such a direct effect on spiking blood sugar. And one thing to note that I actually found in the research is that the glycemic index of honey can actually differ between varieties. So depending on the botanical source, the GI values can range from anywhere from about 32 to 85 have been reported, with the GI of any given honey appearing to depend largely upon its relative concentration of fructose. And something else that I found is there actually is over 320 different varieties of honey. And the composition of it can vary substantially depending upon the variety of the plant that the nectar is actually derived from, and then also the environmental conditions where the specific plant grows. So that was just something super interesting that I didn't know, that there's over 320 varieties and they have varying GI responses or GI values, which GI is just stands for the glycemic index. So it basically tells you, how like the glycemic index of certain carbohydrates will tell you how high that carbohydrate spikes blood sugar, right? So the glycemic response of that. So it's just super interesting to note that there's like I said, over 320 different varieties of honey out there with varying GI responses. So I guess that means you got to try out a few different ones and see what you respond best to. But I also found a recent systematic review actually looking at honey supplementation and exercise. And this was pretty recent. It was from July 2019, so not too long ago. And what this review showed, it showed that a small body of research is beginning to surface surrounding the potential application of honey as a strategy to either enhance athletic performance, improve recovery, or otherwise influence responses to exercise. So this review appraised research examining the effects of honey composition in combination with exercise in humans. And they concluded that as honey is a natural substance comprising of about 80% carbohydrate, like we said, primarily fructose and glucose, and is known to have antioxidant, antimicrobial, and anti-inflammatory properties, there exists a theoretical basis for its use as a nutritional supplement in exercise populations. So that was part of the conclusion that came out of this systematic review. And they also mentioned that honey exhibits natural antioxidant properties that may provide an appropriate balance between controlling the immunosuppressive response to exercise and also maintaining the signaling pathways necessary for positive training adaptation. So I think honey has a really great potential to aid in aid as a pre-workout and even a post-workout source of carbohydrate. Again, this question said thoughts on honey being a carb source when trying to put on muscle. My thoughts would be that it is definitely a great source, and I will link this systematic review in the show notes so you can check that out for further details. And also, I did a recent podcast with Dr. Paul Saladino. It was episode 61, titled All Things Carnivore, and we dove into, Dr. Paul dove into honey in great detail, and he talked all about the benefits of honey and how he started to incorporate it in his diet. And he specifically recommends getting raw organic honey. And he also mentioned a bunch of studies, probably a lot of the ones that were referenced in this systematic review that I mentioned, but I will link those studies in the show notes so you can check those out as well. And if you don't know what the show notes are, you can, if you're listening to this on iTunes, you can swipe up and you'll see the show notes and the description there. If you're listening to it on another platform, there's usually like a read more button. You can click on that, or you can just go to my website, METFLEXLIFE.com. And if you go to the resources tab in the menu, it's a drop-down menu and you'll see it says podcast. You can click on that, and those are all the show notes for all of the podcasts that have been released so far. So definitely check that out. And then another fun fact that I learned was, which is really cool, is most microorganisms don't grow in honey. So sealed honey it doesn't spoil, so it can last for thousands of years, which is really, really crazy. So that's pretty cool and just a fun fact, something that I learned. But anyway, hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into, carbohydrates in general, the different types of carbohydrates, and then also obviously honey as a good source of, pre-workout carbs or even post-workout carbs. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. Another, quick shout out to our sponsor for this month, Organifi. If you want to check out any of Organifi's products, specifically the ones that I personally use on a regular basis are the protein powders. Chocolate is my favorite. They also have a vanilla version. And then if you want to try out that red juice I talked about, you can go to www.organifi.com/METFLEX and use the code METFLEX for 15% off any of their products. All right, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time.